And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Fringe, retired police officer and investigator who has been abducted by ETs while being awake in the middle of the day. Fringe, thank you for joining me and welcome.
Oh, thank you for having me, Jeff. It's great to be here.
Well, Fringe, let's kind of just start at the beginning and go with the first time you were abducted or your first memories of having ET contact.
Yeah, well, that's a great place to start. I'm not even sure if I've ever started there, so that's actually fantastic. So my very first memories of having contact with what we call aliens now, I was about 3.5 years old, and I was living just outside of a naval base in New London, Connecticut. And I've actually since gone back and kind of reconstructed this, spoken to my mother, to see which apartment we were living in, et cetera, because I was quite young. But my first experience was waking up paralyzed, unable to move, with two creatures standing in my doorway. The memory is not very long. And shortly after that, I actually have no memories for shortly after that. So there were two very tall, very skinny creatures. They appeared to be very white, but with a little bit of a tinge of gray, not pure white. And they almost seemed to be communicating with each other. And the only way I can explain it is they were kind of peeking in at me, almost like not sure what they were about to find, which I know sounds strange, but there I was laying there paralyzed and kind of taking it all in, and I don't remember anything after that. So I don't know if I was abducted. I don't know what happened after that. I'm not sure what even happened before that.
Is it possible that around that age or even younger, you had some sort of near-death experience?
So I did have what I look back on now and think it probably was a near-death experience. I was actually quite a bit older, maybe 6 or 7 years old, might have been 8. And that was actually my second anomalous event in my life. I was, maybe 7 or 8. I was out playing in the woods. I used to play in the woods by myself a lot, or with a friend, or with my little sister. I was out playing in the woods. It was winter, and I was in a long fur coat and heavy boots. The fur coat was fake, obviously. And a friend of mine and I were ice skating or ice booting on a pond in Connecticut. And next thing I knew, I'd fallen through the ice of the pond, and I was wearing a very, very heavy coat and boots and, full winter clothing. Fell through the ice, and I actually came up under the ice, and my clothing was really heavy, and I couldn't get out. And I remember multiple times trying to find a way out of the ice. And then one of the last things I saw was just white. I came up under the ice, and everything was just white. And then my next memory is of me being pulled out by my little friend, by another 6 or 7-year-old girl. She had gotten a branch, and she was pulling me out of the pond. And it was one of those incidents that even as a kid, I knew that there was something wrong. It made no sense that I was under the ice and seeing white and seeing what I thought was going to be the end of my life, from a kid's point of view. And then my next memory is actually being pulled out of the ice by another little kid. And, looking at it in hindsight, and every time I've actually looked at it, I've thought, man, how did that little girl pull me out from the ice? And so I don't have any memories of being on the other side or, getting any information or seeing any beings or anything like that. But it was definitely something very interesting that happened that I probably shouldn't have survived. And that's really all I can say about it. I walked home actually afraid that I was going to get in trouble because I had ruined this giant fur coat that I had on. I still had it on when I got pulled out from the ice. I've actually tried to reach this gal in recent years to kind of get her side of it, because at the time she was pretty freaked out too. But we were little kids, so there wasn't a whole lot to say other than I'm not sure how that happened, but here I am. And then it was actually after that, what very well could have been a near-death experience, was my second memory of having experience with an entity. So after that near-death experience, I ended up with, as crazy as it sounds, do a lot of people qualify these things? A little tiny green man living in my left hand in a little pouch in my left hand. This thing would come out, run around. We would engage in communication that was telepathic. Of course, at the time, I wasn't thinking these types of words. And that lasted for maybe 2 years after that experience. Now, in hindsight, I understand after now as an adult, and actually just very recently in the last year, looking into the abduction research, it's actually very common for little kids to encounter the phenomenon and for it to take on a cartoon character and maybe bunny rabbits and, things you might see on television. It's actually pretty common. But of course, at the time, I just thought I had a little green entity living in my hand. It wasn't until I spoke to a couple of researchers who actually stopped me and said, wait a minute, let's talk about this entity who lived in your hand. It's something that your average person probably wouldn't take seriously and think this is some type of a imaginary friend. But when I speak to researchers about it, they say it's actually very common to have something like this as a child. So that was my second awareness of having entity involvement as a kid.
Many near death experiencers start having UFO or ET contact afterwards, but apparently you had it before your first NDE. So that may mean to me that perhaps other people in your family have also had ET contact. Is that true for you?
Yes, it's actually true on both sides of my family. So there's contact on my mother's side. And again, this is all in hindsight. As an adult, I have now gone back and, we speak about these things now. I've asked my mother, I've talked to her, and it's on both sides of my family. So my mother's side, as well as my biological father's side, extensive involvement on my biological father's side of the family. So I have it on both sides. So, I was probably just born into it. There's a lot of genetics and bloodlines involved in what they seem to be interested in. So it was probably happening. It was already happening to my mother before I was even born. So I was probably just born into it.
Do you have Rh negative blood?
I do not. So I do not have Rh negative blood, although I do have Basque in my genetics. And they're well known for having a high incidence of Rh negative blood. And Rh negative blood is actually a recessive trait. So, for instance, my mother and my sister both have an extra vertebrae. We all run very cold, with the low blood pressure, et cetera. So there's a lot of traits of the Rh negative blood, but none of us that I'm aware of are Rh negative.
Now, has your mother only had contact with ETs or other beings as well?
I'd like to let my mom tell her own story if she ever decides to someday, but generically speaking, she's had contact with the last so-called alien being she's had contact with that I'm aware of was last December, and she actually saw a mantid being in her bedroom. She actually had never, she wasn't exposed to the material. So when she saw a being similar to it in media, she wrote to me immediately, said, oh my gosh, this is what I saw in my bedroom, last night or whatever it was. So she didn't even have any conscious awareness that these beings were even out there. She's also had experience with hatman, shadow people, a lot of what she would characterize as demonic attacks, etc. So this has been going on for her for quite some time too, since she was a child.
I've had a couple guests speak about Hatman, and I really don't know a lot about this being. Can you tell me who this is?
Sure. So my first experience with Hatman was I was about 17 years old, and I was laying on a bed, but I was propped up and sitting up because I was actually waiting for some friends to come pick me up. And wide awake, I look up and this gigantic entity appears in the doorway, super tall. What is it about doorways? I don't know. Super tall, wearing a hat and a cape type outfit. It's not a great word to say stalked, but marched over, whatever it did, it came over and got on top of me. This was probably the most frightened I've been as, it's for sure as a young adult and possibly even throughout most of my adulthood. It was just terrifying. I had no idea what it was, what it wanted, what it was going to do, but it felt like it was trying to kill me. I thought it was, going to die. Without trying to be overly dramatic, this is the feeling of malevolence and evil coming off of it, and then believing that I was about to die. It was hard to breathe, etc. And of course, in my 17-year-old mind, I probably thought it lasted for 2 or 3 hours, but it was just a few minutes, and then it was gone. So that was my first experience with what I only now understand is called hatman. So of course, at the time, there's not even any internet, there's hardly anything out there at all on this topic, certainly not that I was exposed to. And so this was the beginning, actually. I think I had a little gap, but then this was the beginning of my being exposed to hatman and what are known as shadow people or shadow beings. Again, I did not know that's what they were called at the time, but I spent the entirety of my adult life, up until recently even, dealing with these shadow people or shadow entities. And they materialize in your bedroom or wherever. People see them in various different places. And a lot of times they are getting on top of people and making people feel like they're about to die. Now, as an adult, and just very recently being exposed to the abduction research, and after putting my own pieces of this together, so as an adult, I've been dealing with these shadow people for 30 years, 40, I'm 55 now, so many, many years. It was only about this time last year, or shortly before this time last year, that I realized that there was something else going on. And sometimes these shadow people were actually transporting me to an abduction experience. And so I kind of started putting this together. And then lo and behold, I come across the abduction research, and I come across Ted Rice. I'm not sure if you've heard of Ted Rice, but and other abductees who have seen these shadow people actually using technology. And it turns out that at least some of these shadow beings are actually gray aliens using technology. And they're using this technology to enter what we would call the astral realm or the spiritual realm as sort of like a transition between the 4D, astral spiritual realm and the 3D physical realm. And so at least some of these beings, I believe, are actually just technology of the grace, unfortunately. And so, a lot of people will see other types of shadow entities. They will see shadow spiders and shadow animals and all kinds of shadow stuff. And it's only now that I know that this is actually related to the abduction phenomenon, at least in some cases. I'm not saying every single case of shadow people out there is 100% a gray alien, but it's certainly something with a lot of overlap and something that can't be separated from the abduction phenomenon, which I'm not sure a whole lot of people are actually aware of. I've said before, if you ask people who's seen a UFO, you'll get a few hands. Who's seen an alien, you're going to get fewer hands. But if you ask people, have you seen a shadow being or a hat man, a lot of hands will start going up. And that's, I think, where we have to start asking some questions, like how many people is this actually happening to when we get into the shadow people and the shadow beings and Hatman? To answer your question, hopefully Hatman appears to be their boss, the boss of the shadow people.
I feel pretty confident that you've asked yourself, why me? Why does all this stuff happen to me? What have you concluded?
I have asked myself that, and what I've concluded is the majority of it is genetics and bloodlines. And again, I have this on both sides of my family. The abduction research shows that this is generational, and that at least one parent of an abductee is also an abductee. And they've gone back, I think, to the late 1800s with generational abductions, at least in the modern day. What was happening before that might be another question. And then I also have some interesting history on my father's side of the family with these entities known as the Lady and another entity he called De Nino. And my father, my biological father, whom I did not meet until I was an adult, was heavily involved with these entities and with some other unsavory activities. We could just leave it there. But he was definitely worshiping these entities. He had actually replaced, I believe he was born Catholic and the family was mostly Catholic, but he actually has it written in his diary that De Nino showed him who the true Christ was. And so he had completely abandoned Catholicism to trade it in for De Nino. And if you really look at these entities, again, we can't subtract them from the abduction phenomenon. These entities appear to a lot of different people. It's another one of those things where if you ask, have you seen an alien? Not a lot of hands go up. If you ask, have you seen an entity in your bedroom or the lady or someone looking like even a fake baby Jesus, a lot of hands will go up. So it's linked to the abduction phenomenon. My father was also levitated, apparently, according to him, levitated in his backyard by these entities. And again, we can't subtract the entity from the levitation and then into UFOs. So it's all related. So hopefully that answers your question. I think it just came from bloodlines and genetics and perhaps even a devotion to these creatures before I was ever born. I've spoken to researchers who say they think these creatures believe they owned me before I was ever born.
Now, Chris Bledsoe encountered a female being, and also another ET contactee, Billy Meyer, contacted a female being. Are these the same women, or is this being appearing to different people as women?
Well, I don't think there's any way to know for certain that this would be the same being. So obviously there's a being or multiple beings out there presenting themselves as, the nickname is the Lady or Fatima. I believe in Chris Bledsoe's case, without putting any words into his mouth, he has said that his lady has also appeared around the world, and I believe he links her to the Fatima sighting. Is this the same entity my biological father is seeing? I don't know. But whatever this is presenting themselves as this entity, and maybe this is an archetype they're trying to present themselves as. I'm not sure. It would be really hard to say that even, so many people in the UFO community have seen this entity, but I don't think there's any way of knowing that it's the same entity.
Now, do you consider this entity to be benevolent or the opposite?
No, I would be the opposite. And especially in the case of my own personal history with my family, it would definitely be the opposite. My biological father was engaged in an international criminal enterprise, a very unsavory international criminal enterprise, even including being a contractor for the mob. And so these entities were definitely encouraging things that would definitely not be on the side of good. I can just put it that way. So absolutely, in my case with my own family, my own history, these entities were not good at all. Now, keep in mind, my father thought they were good. And did he see that his activities and his worship of these entities, that it didn't really wash? I mean, he didn't even have any conscience about what he was doing. So he saw these entities as a matter of fact, the De Nino entity has saved his life on multiple occasions. So even people who can look at that and say, oh, well, the entity saved my life, it must be a good entity. I would just say, think again, because a lot of times they're saving our lives for their own purposes. And that was clearly in my case, for my father to continue with his activities that these entities were feeding on for just to keep it PG.
Let me stop you for 1 second. Who is the De Nino entity?
So the De Nino entity, according to my father, is baby Jesus. But when we look at De Nino entity, especially at least in my father's case, as, is this a so-called good or bad entity, for lack of better terms? It's definitely a bad entity. And so he, again, had replaced what he grew up believing as Christ. This entity appeared to him. This entity told him that he was, in fact, the real Christ, and to worship him, De Nino. It's my understanding that these entities actually go back to some old African gods that are associated with Santeria. And that's in my family as well. So I think that's how they got involved in it.
Can you tell us about some of your own abductions during the middle of the day in broad daylight?
Yeah, and so the incident that has happened to me in the middle of the day in broad daylight, I can't even tell you that it was an abduction because my memory actually ends after the entity. But I can tell you what happened. And this was actually the incident that freaked me out. I mean, bad. It freaked me out bad. It made me question whether I was even sane, because this happened during the middle of the day, wide awake, no nap, no sleep, no drugs, no alcohol, not expecting, any interactions of any kind. It was the middle of the day, it was sometime in the afternoon, and my husband had decided that he was going to go down to our garage. And he was actually gone for about 22 minutes when I ended up going back and looking at our Ring video doorbell camera, and he was gone for 22 minutes. Some background to this story is during this period of time, we had a house guest. She was a temporary house guest. She's a very close family friend of ours. We're actually related by marriage. And she was temporarily staying with us for about 6 weeks during the summer, last summer. And during this period, she would sometimes be gone for a few days. And then she would send us a text message, hey, I'm going to be by the house. I'm going to spend the night. And it was just a situation where she wasn't spending every night. She was only spending some nights. And so it was during the middle of the day. And I'm trying to figure out how to tell the story. So I'm sitting there on my couch, minding my own business. I think I was scrolling through Twitter actually at the time. And I hear the door not really slam, but shuts loud. Our front door I live in a condominium unit. Our front door has an automatic shut. And so it shuts. It's almost a slam when it shuts because it's being forced closed. And it's a very distinctive sound. I hear the footsteps. So I've heard the door, I've heard the sound. And now I, of course, think either my husband has come back into the unit or there's a chance that our temporary house guest has come back to the unit. So in walks the temporary house guest, very tall, very blonde. And she says something to me, and I thought I had written it down, and I went back to review this incident, and I did not write it down. But she says something to me that was a little bit unusual. So let's just say that this person would normally just say, hey, how's it going? The person said, what's up, duck? I'm completely making that up, but it was something that was entirely not something she would say. But I just remember thinking, okay, well, I'm just going to roll with it. I don't know what's going on, but whatever. We engage in a full conversation. And it's my perception that we have a conversation and that she walks right in front of me and goes upstairs. And upstairs is where she was staying. That's where her bedroom was. She had a bedroom and a bathroom up there. And that's exactly what she would do. She would come home. We would chat, she would go about her business. When my husband comes upstairs 22 minutes later, only knowing this in hindsight, I told my husband, just because, of a common courtesy, hey, our house guest came home, while you were gone. And he gives me kind of a weird look. And he says, wait, what? Are you sure? I said, well, of course I'm sure, And time is passing. And over the period of maybe 20 or 30 minutes or however long it is, he asked me again, are you sure, that she's here, that she came home? And now I'm getting irritated. Of course, I'm sure she's here and that she came home. We had a conversation. I watched her walk into the living room during the middle of the day. We had a conversation. She's upstairs. And he says, I don't think she's here. I don't think she's upstairs. And now I'm irritated. I'm going, of course she's upstairs. And I actually, over a series of events, I actually ended up walking upstairs, to get her so she could prove that she was there. So, in fact, she was not upstairs. And not only was she not upstairs, she had never come home. And so by this time, I'm actually losing it because I'm actually questioning my own sanity. Like, how could something like this happen? How could I have had a full-blown 100% hallucination during the middle of a day, a full-blown conversation? I could have told you what clothes she was wearing and that, she came in conversation and walked upstairs. So now I'm freaking out a little bit, thinking, what in the world just happened? I check my Ring video doorbell. She's not on it. She didn't come in. That door never opened, actually. The only thing that my video doorbell picked up was my husband leaving, and my husband comes back 22 minutes later. So now I'm texting our house guest and I'm saying, hey, did you come home? At any time today, did you come home? And she said, no, absolutely not. I haven't come home. And so at that point, and during last summer, I had a lot of activity that was happening, usually at night, sometimes during the middle of the day, but usually at night. And at this point, I was now starting to consider, wait a minute, what actually just happened? So, I mean, I have no other, my only choices at this point are I completely hallucinated the incident, or someone trying to look a lot like my house guest actually walked into my living room and we had a conversation. What actually happened, I don't know. These entities can control our perception and very clearly did control my perception during the middle of the day, making me believe that my house guest had come home in the middle of the day. So this was the incident that it really got to me. I mean, it really hit me hard. It made me stop and ask myself, is it possible I could have hallucinated this entire incident? Could I have had it wrong? Did this not actually happen? So it really bothered me. And hopefully it can come across as unusual as it was. I mean, sounds, conversation, everything. And yet nothing actually had happened. No evidence whatsoever on my doorbell that anyone had come home at all. And then the house guest actually not being there at all and her denying ever even coming home. Now, these entities, and I've dealt with a lot of these entities, very tall and very blonde. It would be an easy perception control in hindsight, but that it was able to happen in the middle of the day with my full faculties in full operation, it really disturbed me. It was very disturbing. That's probably the single most disturbing thing that's happened to me.
Have you ever had face-to-face contact with an ET that looks like a gray or a mantis or a Nordic or anything like that?
Well, I would call that one face-to-face with something that people would call a Nordic.
Hmm.
And are we talking about 3D wide awake? Or are we talking about abduction experiences?
Both, really.
So the 3D wide awake, which I mean, I would characterize my childhood incident as being awake. Some people would say, well, that was just sleep paralysis. You could have been hallucinating. That's fine. My 3D wide awake with the Hatman was wide awake. And then I had an incident last year. It was kind of around the same time during the summer. I had a lot of activity building up to about this time last year. And I've actually spent the whole last year trying to stop the activity in any way, shape, or form that I can. So I'd have to look at my journal to see what day it was, last year. I actually wake up to full awakeness, not a hypnagogic state, to I would characterize it as gray, although it had an extremely pointed V chin. There are some people who think that there's actually a manted gray hybrid. So this could possibly fall into that category. It had a really long neck and it was looking at me from behind a wall in my bedroom. And I would have to draw a schematic for you to understand. And I saw it and I just thought it was kind of a weird reaction. My first thought was I had by this time been talking to researchers who were kind of trying to help me deal with this. And one of the researchers had told me they hate light. So I had a flashlight next to my bed. I always have had a flashlight next to my bed, not for this purpose. But the first thing I thought was, I'm going to grab my phone, not to take a picture of it. I'm going to grab my phone and I'm going to turn on my flashlight on my phone. I'm going to shine it at this thing to get it out of my space. Because at this point, I do not want anything to do with these things. I don't want them in my home. I don't want them in my space. And so I'm trying to do everything I can to stop these interactions. But if I think about that logically, is that really the first move you're going to do if there's a gray alien in your bedroom? I think I'll grab my phone, not to take a picture of it, not to take a video, but to turn on the flashlight so I can scare it out. So even my actions in that moment seemed like they were probably being controlled. So that was a regular, wide awake 3D interaction. I've seen many, many creatures during abductions. And then there have been times during the middle of the day that weren't quite as crazy as the one I just explained to you, but I've had instances during the day of, there was one time I was standing in my bathroom and I don't know if I lost track of just a couple minutes, and I end up being really a little bit disoriented and kind of dizzy. And it takes me just a few seconds to realize my pants are on backwards. So different things like that have happened, especially throughout this last year. I really started paying attention to these things, the things that we blow off. When I was in my 30s, I would wake up with my pajama pants inside out. And I would say to myself, did you put your pajama pants on inside out? But I never, put the whole picture together until really this last year or two, when I started really looking at my life and thinking, wait a minute, I saw aliens in my bedroom when I was 3.5. Now I'm waking up with my pants on backwards, kind of just putting all those puzzle pieces together.
Do you think it's possible that you have implants?
I've been asked that question by a lot of people. I don't know. I had a lot of medical problems when I was in my 30s and 40s. I have been to every specialist in the country for practically every condition known to man. I had a lot of investigations by a lot of top doctors into my health. So I've had a lot of scans. I've been scanned for things like MS. I've had brain scans. At one point, I was fairly well convinced that I had something in my left ear, but nothing to do with aliens or implants at that time. And they told me I had scar tissue in that ear. But I absolutely cannot say I have an implant anywhere. I have been scanned up one side and down the other. Now you hear stories of these things being removed, if you're going to a doctor's appointment or what have you, but I certainly cannot say that I have one, although supposedly most, if not all, abductees do.
Do you think it's possible that you have human alien hybrid children?
Well, I've definitely had that experience. So I've definitely had the experience of meeting a hybrid child, a very strange mine, but not mine feeling. She was had very, very thin blonde hair, and she was very frail looking. In hindsight, now that I know what I know, she might not have been the age that she appeared to be at that time. She appeared to be maybe 3 or 4 years old. But because they're so frail, she could have easily been 10 or 12, and I wouldn't have really understood that at that time. And then I've also come across a lot of children. Half of my abductions probably are involving taking care of children, taking care of hybrid children, taking care of their children. They're partly theirs and partly ours. And it's something, again, I didn't understand. When I really realized and really wrapped my mind around this, I was actually very reluctant to even realize what was happening, let alone admit what was happening, and then try to figure out the complexity of what was happening. Even with researchers, when I first started investigating, I said, well, you don't understand. I'm babysitting a lot of children. I'm like hugging them and playing with children. And they'd say, oh, yeah, well, that's what happens. Okay, well, I didn't know that. Why would an alien need me to play with children? At the time, it didn't make any sense. Now, in hindsight, obviously, it all makes sense when you look into the abduction research. But there's lots of kids out there, and that's pretty much half my job. I feel like half my job is being tested, medical procedures, testing, and babysitting children.
As a police officer and an investigator, if you encountered someone who had experiences like you, how would you treat the situation?
Yeah, it would have been very interesting. You mean with the knowledge I had at the time or the knowledge I have now? Because it would definitely be two different things. So when I was on the job, I actually encountered a lot of people who supposedly had mental illness. And it was interesting because there was always a part of me knowing that at least some of what they were seeing and saying was probably true. Unfortunately, especially with individuals experiencing mental illness, a lot of times they can be homeless, and a lot of times there's also drugs involved. And so that just sends it into a whole other area. And there's a lot of overlap in that area. But even as a police officer, I knew that there was more going on than what met the eye. And that was only because of my own experiences, which, by the way, I always characterized as spiritual experiences. It was normal. I grew up a Christian. It was normal to have a spiritual experience. I never thought that it was anything unusual until I realized that these aliens were involved. But in hindsight, well, now we have people like, I think it's Jerry Marzinski out there saying that he's now involved with a lot of people diagnosed with mental illness who are actually being accosted by shadow entities. And so I think we might end up understanding that at least some people diagnosed with mental illness are actually dealing with these unseen entities or shadow people. So in hindsight, well, with what I know now, I would send them to Marzinski is what I would do.
What do you think the agenda is of these ETs?
Well, I'm actually one of the people who does not think the agenda is good. So when I first reluctantly acknowledged what was happening to me just for myself, I thought these were space brothers from outer space, extraterrestrial. I was of a new age type of a mindset. They've got to be here just to raise our vibration or, help us ascend to 5D, all this kind of stuff. I actually bought into that hook, line, and sinker. And that's kind of how I dealt with my own experiences is, this is something good and positive. It actually took for me an embarrassing amount of time to realize that there was actually a lot more to it than just that. And when I realized that this was not all Love and Light Space Brothers, I actually started pushing back pretty aggressively during my abduction experiences. And that resulted in an extreme degree of punishment. And what I sometimes characterize as being kicked up the food chain and literally punished. And so to make it a little shorter, I don't think it's good. I think that even if you look at the different opinions that are out there, if you look at all of the abduction research, the researchers will all agree at bare minimum, these creatures have been engaged in some kind of hybridization program for at least decades, probably at least the late 1800s. They've gone about it in a very covert but meticulous manner. It seems like their first creatures they created, they didn't look human at all. They could hardly pass. And now, decades later, they're creating hybrids between the Greys and us that can pass as human. And so even if we just say we don't know whether they're here for good or whether they're here for evil, and of course that's only coming from a human perspective as we would see it, are they beneficial to humans or not beneficial to humans? We'd have to ask ourselves, why are they creating these hybrids? Because that's at least one area where almost all researchers can agree they're creating hybrids. Okay, what's the agenda? They're doing it in secret. They're kidnapping us out of our beds. They are stealing our biological material. if these creatures were here for our own good, at bare minimum, they could make themselves known, knock on the front door, understand that we like money and food, and make an exchange. If they were here to offer to help us, uh, just from their own benevolence, again, that would be above board, and there would be some consent involved. So just the totality of my experiences, and then looking at the abduction research, looking at my own family's history and involvement with these entities, and including the unsavory activities that were also going on, it's my personal opinion these things are not here for our good. They are hostile to humans. At best, they treat us like cattle. There are some abductees who get treated better than others, depending on whether we're going with the program or not. And if we look at the dark side of the abduction research, they're looking to take over the planet with these hybrids. These hybrids are loyal to the alien agenda. They very much look human. They do not act human, or they definitely don't act with any of the good qualities that humans have. So yeah, they're not here for us, in my personal opinion. And it wasn't until I realized that I actually started being severely punished during my abductions, which is a whole other story.
Do you think there are any good ETs out there?
That's a great question, and something I've put a lot of thought into very recently. So I think there are benevolent and good beings we would categorize as a non-human intelligence. I absolutely believe that. I've actually believed that I've been saved from abductions from benevolent forces. Whether they are in the category of what we would call aliens, I don't know. So these aliens, we call them aliens. I don't think they're from outer space. Excuse me, I think they're actually from right here. They are single-mindedly focused on this hybrid program. And is there a benevolent counterpart to the mantid, to the reptilian, to the gray, the short grays and the tall grays and the Nordics? I don't know. Are there good mantids out there? I'll just say no, there aren't. It's almost impossible to be a good mantid because they're all controlled by this hive mind mentality, and they're all single-mindedly focused. So unlike a human who could be either so-called good or so-called bad, or usually a mixture of both, it would be very difficult for a mantid in a mantid genetics with the mantid hive mind to actually break out of that system, which is an entirely telepathic system. So all the creatures actually know what anyone is thinking at any given time. So it would be difficult for them to break out. Are there beings that are maybe not mantids, and I'm just using that as an example, we would also characterize as alien or ET, like an exact counterpart? I don't know. But I do believe that there are positive beings out there on our side wanting to assist us. I just don't think that we're putting, I don't think we're characterizing properly. I think we're looking at these negative aliens, the ones involved in the abductions and taking us out of our beds at night, and we're trying to make them into positive aliens. We're almost projecting onto them. We're positively projecting onto them. And we want to think they're here to raise us to 5D and, to help us in whatever ascension is happening. And, they're here for our own good. They're creating human 2.0. This is all for our benefit. I think that is a possibility, that those creatures are out there, and there is a faction wanting to help us and wanting all those things for us. I don't think it's the beings that are ripping us out of our beds at night.
Do you see UFOs?
I've only seen UFOs. So it depends on what you want to call seeing a UFO. I've only seen UFOs in my conscious memories during abductions. So I don't have any incidents of, driving down the street, seeing a UFO and then missing 2 hours. So the UFOs I have seen, I've either been abducted into, been inside of them, and during an abduction experience.
What do you think about the UFOs that are on the internet of the Navy pilots spotting them?
I can't even make a judgment on it. I really can't. I'm very, very late to the game when it comes to the UFO phenomenon. I just got into any research whatsoever about a year ago. I mean, that incident specifically, I have heard so many things about that incident. I've heard that, and maybe you've had guests on saying this, or you might know something about this. I have heard that all of the munitions were removed from that ship, and that they didn't even have their normal standby craft that they would normally have loaded with munitions, even though they were in a training incident. Just a couple of really suspicious things that makes me unwilling to commit to whether that was our technology or their technology. I think there's going to end up being a lot of overlap between their technology and our technology. And I will go so far as to say much, if not most, of what we see in our skies with our eyes is our technology.
One of my previous guests and I talked about that the Earth is a prison of the galaxy, and the bad ETs are the prison guards keeping us here, and there are good ETs out there trying to break us free. So I thought it'd be especially interesting to ask you, being involved in law enforcement, what do you think about that?
So I think that that is a possibility. I think there could be a prison planet component to our reality. But at the same time, I think, again, that there are benevolent forces out there. I don't think that we should get into a black pill mentality where the negatives have all of the control over everything. And, we have no power and we have no choices. So I do think that I have mixed feelings on reincarnation. I, at one point, didn't entertain it at all. And then I became fairly well convinced that it was probably true. And now I'm kind of going back to the middle of the road, because if you really look at reincarnation, you look at childhood memories, we now have children who claim to have been the same person. And we have to start reaching for some explanations for that, saying, okay, well, maybe they were fractaled of each other's soul, or the soul split. We have near-death experiences and a lot of overlap with the abduction experience. And so I think all of these entities are heavily involved in all three of these things. And they're known for their deception and their manipulation. And so do they just want us to think that they're in control of at least an aspect of the afterlife? We have insiders who have been threatened with afterlife ramifications if they come forward even on their own deathbed. So I think there could be an aspect of the prison planet involved here, but I don't think they have the ultimate control that they want us to think they do.
When you were working in law enforcement, did you ever get called out to, or at least some of your fellow officers get called out to a UFO sighting? And
No.
well, what about
Mm-mm.
did you guys ever talk about it at the station, like UFOs or anything?
Nothing. Zero. I did not speak about UFOs or think about UFOs until maybe 2 years ago. No, nothing. There was no behind the scenes. There was no, I mean, I was out on patrol in the middle of the night, for an all-night shift many, many, many times. I have no conscious memories of any sightings, no talk of it, no coming across even old timers who spoke about it, nothing like that. There was always some more of, maybe I would call it a spiritual thinking, or, this house might be haunted, or something really strange happens at this house sometimes, that kind of stuff, but nothing to do with UFOs.
How many times do you think you've been contacted by an
Oh
ET?
my. I stopped counting, and by contact, I would clarify to say abductions, attempted abductions, downloads, messages, etc. So it's a big, wide net. I stopped counting last summer at 230 in just the last 2.5 years. So I'm upwards of 300 by now, and that's being very, very conservative. I think So I think the reason that number is so high is because I started pushing back and being difficult. And I think a lot of what was happening to me over this last year was a lot of testing and trying to figure out, number one, why was I waking up and able to see what was happening? Why was I able to get out of their control? So I think that's why I have so many contacts. And it hasn't stopped yet, but I have managed. I've done many, many, many things, and the list would be probably too long to review on this show. But I've done a lot of things in the last year, starting last May, to limit and reduce the amount of contacts I have, because I am not about it. I do not want this to happen to me. I don't want these creatures in my house. I don't want them snatching me, or heaven forbid, children and grandchildren out of their beds. This is something that does run in my family. It's happening to other relatives without giving their own story away. This is not good. It is not okay, and I don't want it. And so I have been trying to stop it. And I think that is probably why I have so many contacts. Although it's not actually, there are some other high numbers like that in the abduction research.
Do you think that you will ever be able to completely stop it?
I like to hope so, but I'm also a realist. And I know abductees. I am aware of one abductee who is 86 years old and he is still being taken. I'm aware of a female who is in her 70s. She is being taken. So again, I'm a realist. So I've decided to do whatever it is I can do to stop it. They're not going to take me with any permission from me or with any consent from me, because there's also a strange component of this where they're always looking for consent and permission. It's very strange. So that's what I try to take away. I try to take away consent, permission. If I wake up to, being lucid enough, I will actually physically fight with them and just try to cause as much trouble as I possibly can. I have there's another abductee out there who's actually very, very knowledgeable, much more so than I am. And I have asked this person, who actually knows a lot of kind of inside track stuff, can I become such a problem that I am taken off this roster? The answer to that was no. But I'm not going to stop trying. One thing I'm not going to do is just roll over and say, oh, go ahead and take me. There's nothing I can do anyway. I can promise you that.
You were raised Catholic or Christian. I think it was Christian, right? And you're kind of on the fence about reincarnation. What do you think happens to us after we die?
So, that question has gotten very complicated for me recently, only recently. So I was born a Christian. I feel like I was born a Christian, just born into it. I was raised a Christian. I would have told you that I had the strongest faith on the entire planet, not in a bragging way, just in a solid, matter of fact, there's no doubt in my mind way. When I realized the totality of what was happening to me and the different things like soul transfers that they were doing, that's what really blew my mind. And again, I thought these were space brothers. I didn't look at this from a religious point of view. I remember seeing a gentleman by the name of Ray Boucher saying that these aliens were actually demons, and I completely laughed that off. I thought it was ridiculous because I, at the time, thought it was our space brothers. So prior to 2 years ago, and I'm just spitballing that number, I had been out of my body 100 times, hundreds of times. I don't even know how to count how many times I had been out of my body. So between my religious beliefs and knowing that I could exist without my body, that my consciousness remained, that I was able to make decisions and move about, and in this astral or spiritual realm, however you want to call it, there was no doubt in my mind that when I left my body, I would be going straight to heaven. No doubt. There was no question whatsoever. Once I realized that these alien, so-called alien entities, were very much involved with the near-death experience and the reincarnation stuff. So I very slowly started investigating reincarnation maybe 2 years ago, and I started realizing, man, there's a lot here. You can't really look away from some of this stuff. So once I was putting all those pictures together, I actually got to a point where I was pretty well black-pilled into that prison planet idea that we spoke about not too long ago. Oh my gosh, did I have it wrong this whole time? And these negative entities are actually in charge of the whole shebang. And I went into a very, very dark place. It was devastating for me, that belief, or I had to at least consider that that was true. I had to at least consider that it was possible. So what I did during this period was I actually had to stop and say, am I a Christian because I was raised this way, because I was taught to believe this way, or am I a Christian because I believe that this is true and it doesn't make sense and is it logical and etc. And so what actually ended up happening is I ended up realizing through the abduction experiences and through a lot of other things that were going on that these entities are very manipulative and very deceptive. And so all the things that I was considering, again, the really dark prison planet, that they're in charge of everything, all religions are not true and just manipulation and actually seeded by these entities themselves. Once I realized, wait a minute, these things are lying about just about everything. They're very deceptive. They try to appear as things that they're not. And again, I said earlier in the podcast, it took me an embarrassingly long time to realize that what I was saying was not actually true and real. So during this period, I started thinking, oh gosh, okay, great. So I go to exit my body at the end of this life, and I'm going to be met by a so-called alien pretending to be Jesus or a dead relative, because this is what they do. They've done it to me. And they're going to try to recycle me into, this prison planet theory. They wipe your memory and here you come back again. I was pretty black-pilled, devastated, full-blown spiritual worldview crisis. And again, once I realized how deceptive they were and how manipulative they were, I ended up kind of backing off of that and realizing a lot of what they say and do and convey is based in some truth in some way, shape, or form. But so much of it is deception and manipulation. So what is actually true here? And I started realizing that so many of the reincarnation memories can easily be planted by these NHI, just like they plant us with memories during abductions. They plant us with screen memories. They make us think, it's all about the love and light, and you had a great and wonderful spiritual experience, and maybe we even healed you. And, make sure you go out and push the message. So I'm now back to where I started. I think they have some control over the afterlife. I think there are some people who are going to exit their bodies and be met with these entities. I think there can be tricks involved. But I think that even with just some awareness, we can break out of that and not go into if there's a recycling system, because I'm actually open to the whole thing being a deception. I'm open to just about anything they do being a deception. But again, a lot of what they do, they throw some truth in there. So it actually makes sense. So we kind of buy into it. So I think there will be some truth in there. I think they will have some control. If you look at the abduction research, they have the ability, and just from my own personal experience, they have the ability to transfer the soul right out of the body into another body or into a container. So they appear to have some power. But ultimate power, I don't think so. I do believe in a benevolent, omnipotent creator. I think we are here for some good reason. And I think that even if reincarnation is true, ultimately and eventually, we will all find ourselves back in a good place. It might be a really hard road for some of us. It's already been a hard road for me and many others. But I have the hope that ultimately all human souls will actually be reconciled to a benevolent, omnipotent creator. After we die this time, I don't know. I hope so.
After watching this podcast, people may want to reach out to you and ask you questions. Are you open to that?
Oh, absolutely. I answer a lot of questions. Absolutely. I'm mostly on Twitter or X. I get a lot of DMs. I hold a lot of spaces. explore a lot of different ideas. We talk about this type of subject just about every day. If you go into a Twitter space in the UFO Twitter community, there's going to be a space available for anyone to ask anybody questions. And I'm always available for questions. Absolutely. I've spent entire podcasts just answering live questions. So I'm definitely open to it.
Do you have anything that you're working on that you want people to know about?
No, I don't. I don't have anything I'm working on, but I appreciate that. You can find me on Twitter, UFO Twitter. I do spaces and, just kind of hang out in the community, try to give lend an ear to other people this is happening to. This is the abduction phenomenon is something that's happening to, I mean, nobody knows for sure, but the math is coming out to millions of people worldwide. It's probably happening to someone you know. And so I just ask that people keep an open mind to this as a possibility. I think this topic is going to become more and more mainstream and possibly even come to the so-called kitchen table at some point someday. I think there's a possibility that these things will someday present themselves in a savior type capacity, trying to help us stop a nuclear war, give us medicine, give us technology. And all I really have to say about that is be cautious and don't believe everything you hear or everything you see, if and when this ever happens.
There are still lots of people out there that don't believe in the phenomena. What do you think we need to do for them to understand that this is real?
I'm not sure there's anything we can do. I think what I ask of those people is just to keep an open mind. I understand that what I'm saying, and probably a lot of people who come on your show, what we're saying sounds ridiculous. It sounds, like we're hallucinating, or this is maybe some type of psychological process that's happening. But when you really look at the numbers and you look at the number of people across at least several decades now in the modern era who have been reporting the very same things, people who don't know each other, and especially before the age of the internet, people who had no way of knowing each other or contacting each other or hearing each other's stories, all saying very, very similar things. Just think about the old adage, where there's smoke, there's fire. And just keep an open mind. I don't think we can convince anyone. I think a lot of people actually have to experience it for themselves, unfortunately, to be convinced of these things. Because especially when it comes to the alien abduction phenomenon, it's on the fringe of the UFO phenomenon. There are people who 100% believe in UFOs, and they cannot wrap their minds around even considering abductions happening. So I don't think we can convince anyone. I think just keeping an open mind is what I ask. Just keep an open mind that some of these things could be true. This might actually be happening. And as the years go by, if this topic does become more and more mainstream, at that point, people might end up seeing it for themselves. And that's probably the only time that many people will be convinced.
How do you think your experience as a police officer affects you in your investigation into this phenomena?
Well, I said earlier, probably twice already, that it actually took me an embarrassing amount of time to figure out what was actually going on. But on the other hand, if I didn't have the background that I have, if I didn't have my life experience, I might never have figured it out. And so it definitely benefited me, just being an investigator, being able to gather pieces of the puzzle and put things together, having to sift through truth and lies, to figure out what's actually going on at any given time or any given crime scene, et cetera, helped me a lot when I was just able to stop and ask myself, wait a minute, is what I'm seeing actually real? Is what I'm seeing actually happening? And then what is the motive of these beings? Why are they doing what they're doing? Does any of this actually make sense? What they're saying they're doing and what they're actually doing, does that even go together? So it benefited me a lot. And without it, I might not be sitting here with the same message I'm sitting here with today. I might still, I very likely would still be in that camp of these are our benevolent space brothers and they're coming to upgrade us to 5D. And that all this contact is actually beneficial. And, they try to make us feel very special and part of the family. They try to make us feel like we're star seeds and, we're helping humanity, etc. I probably would not have seen through those lies if I didn't have the background that I had. So it's helped me a lot. I credit it with probably why I'm here today.
There are quite a few people out there that would say that ETs are demons. Where are you on that?
So first, I don't think they're ETs in the truest sense of the word. So I don't think these creatures are actually from other planets. I actually think they're probably from right here. And so just the term extraterrestrial sometimes implies, that there's a spaceship traveling from outer space somewhere and arriving here on Earth. I think these creatures have been here for at least thousands of years, maybe even before us. So they're probably quite terrestrial. Although I understand some people say extraterrestrial, meaning, they could have been here before the Earth was even formed. And then I understand that as being extraterrestrial. So I think what we see right now, most of the interference, the abductions, the manipulation comes from these these mantids, these reptilians, the tall grays, the short grays, and a variety of different appearances of these same creatures, because they can project pretty much any appearance that they want to project, and they often just pull it right out of your own mind. So they appear however they like, but these exact creatures, I do not think they're demons. I think, however, that there are demons. I've actually encountered demons, and I do think that demons, evil, malevolent, spiritual entities, to define a demon in my own way, are very much involved in the abduction phenomenon, separate from aliens, but very often working together on the same team for the same goals. So when I first heard Ray Boucher was the first person to ever say that I ever heard say aliens are demons. And I immediately thought, that's ridiculous. They're clearly not demons. They put off a different energy. They have different tasks. They have a different way of doing things. So I do not think that they're the same thing. However, I do think there are spiritual beings behind the scenes. These spiritual beings do not have our best interests in mind. And some of them are higher up the food chain than these aliens that we talk about. And they can use these aliens as almost an avatar. So if you think about a human being able to be possessed, think about an alien being able to be possessed. So I think that's probably where the overlap comes from, because I think they are all on the same team, actually working toward the same goal. And at the same time, I do not think aliens are demons. I think there are two different things.
All right, this podcast has probably been pretty dark for most people, so let's try to finish it up with one last positive message. What can you give me?
Oh dear. I think a positive message would be that I do think that there are benevolent entities out there. I do think that there is a creator out there, benevolent creator out there, that is probably the all-powerful. I do think we have benevolent entities on our side, trying to help us out, trying to root for us. If you think about, there's this old cartoon where people have an angel on one side and a demon or devil on the other side. I think that's probably more accurate than we'd ever even want to imagine. I think we have the angel whispering in our ear, trying to lead us in a certain direction. But on the devil side, the devil will get us, I call it by hook or by crook. They will get us in any way they can. They're interventional. They'll lie, cheat, and steal to get us to lean in their direction. But we do have that angel on our other shoulder whispering in our ear and try to lead us in the right direction. So I do think we have help out there. I do not in any way think it's hopeless. I would just like us all to wake up and realize that we're positively projecting onto the wrong beings. but the right beings are out there. And I think they do want to help us.
Fringe, thank you for your message, and thank you for being my guest.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.